Through my association with academics at the University of Western Cape, I heard that a slave burial ground had been uncovered. And it is there that became a frisson of tension and of activity, because people whose life had no, beyond enslavement in the emancipated period, were no value, had no properties, suddenly were occupying prime real estate in a burgeoning economy at this end. And it resurrected through the bones of the dead the story of our history as slave descendant communities.
People had been very clear about what they wanted when the human remains were exhumed. So the question became, why are archaeologists not listening?
What is the basis of a meaningful relationship to the past? Is it empirical information about diet and work habits? Or is it more than that? Is it different to that?
In a city that has largely made you feel invisible, and a city that has made you believe in its idea of itself, which is a tourism hotspot. So it's a city that creates an image of itself and hides real experiences, and people have real memories of the space.
The mountain range kind of dominated my early years. And then as the group areas pressure started, we moved further onto the Cape Flats, and the mountain was even more hauntingly distant. But the mountain has always been a site of reference. And just the further we moved from it, it was a sign of how our class status changed. So the area that we're now is beyond the former boundary of old Cape Town. This street became known as Prestwich, which is an old English word for the ground or the home of the priest. So it was populated left and on the right-hand side by the formal burial grounds of the established churches of the 19th century. And the first kind of formal burial ground is the Dutch Reformed Church, which is a block away. It was really the burial grounds of the middle class and an upwardly mobile people of the settlements at mausoleum. And then the spot that we are now, then behind us, was the burial ground for enslaved people. And the slaves, enslaved people, were formerly owned by the mercantile capital of the Dutch East India Company. So the responsibility of burying their bodies was that of the presence of organized state. There were no markers, there were no insignia of their identity. We found out that the storage facilities of the fishing company running off Prestwich Street, and below that had been a slave burial ground, and it was for heathen enslaved or for heathens and slaves. So even the school, everything was located on burial ground. Then people started talking about the haunted space. There's a silence about the past, and that kind of filtered the way people recall, but it was the absent dead present in their DNA, within their social milieu, that they will resurrect when they recall memories of this place.
The human remains at Prestwich Street were first uncovered by a demolition crew. There was an old warehouse on the site. And while they were demolishing, they realized that there were really a substantial number of human remains on the site below them. And at that point, the South African Heritage Resources Agency, SARA, was alerted. Now, precisely at that moment, something very important and slightly underhand happened. The new legislation had just come into effect. This was the first big test case of the National Heritage Resources Act. And the Act says that before any archaeological work happens on site, there needs to be a 90-day public consultation process. And SARA made an exception and said, we are going to allow archaeological work, in other words, the exhumation of those remains, during the 90-day period. The 90-day period allows for the possibility of non-exhumation. It says the site can be retained with the remains as a site of conscience and memory. By beginning the excavation, they effectively took that option off the table. The CEO of SARA made that comment at one point, too many people are speaking from the heart, we need to speak from the head.
Yes, exactly.
Like
yes, and I think that almost encapsulates some of the struggle about heart and head are two parts of knowledge making, and they went at the opposite ends of that. And I think the media also picked up on that.
We were engaging SARA, and SARA went with the narrative of government. This is what the legislation says. And it is a legislation that was regulated by an apartheid regime that had no currency for telling the story of the underclass of the city, the invisible people that built the city.
When I actually think about Cape Town, the thing that I always think about is Cape Town was basically built by enslaved people. And if you walk through the city today, you're not going to know it. That history, to a very large extent, is quite silent. And this is one of the physical places that you can come to where enslaved people used to come and worship. So it's so physically linked to them. It was built by them. This is called, the community calls it the Slave Church. Its official name is the SA Sendinggestig or Mission House Meeting Place. But it was very closely linked to enslaved people early in its history. Not only did they come and attend prayer services here, there was also a school for enslaved children. The link this has to Prestwich Place in the 1820s. The people in charge of this church, they managed to buy a property in Somerset Road, and this was the only church where enslaved people could get a proper burial. They were buried there.
On the Prestwich Road, on either side, there was a burial ground for Angolan slaves, right, and other African slaves. There were Portuguese-speaking slaves from Kerala, from Goa, and then also from what is now the national state islands of Indonesia, Malaysia, and the language Malayu became the dominant language of enslaved people and became also the carrier of Islam. Enslavement influenced the music, the cuisine, and just the way Cape Town is still today. When you hear the Atan, it's not just a romantic soundtrack, but it speaks to the DNA of our spirit because it came over on the ships. And our story as a mulatto, as a Cape Creole community, is that of slavery into Africa, across the Indian Ocean. And history is silent about that.
The District 6 Museum works with memories that have been erased, purposefully so, and that our work is really about uncovering, unlayering sort of what people remember about the city, what they remember about District 6. And for us, the discovery of about 3,500 human remains at the Prestwich burial ground, it was really significant for us because it was a moment in which you witnessed the city trying to silence what those remains meant for people and a community around, whether it was District 6 or just Cape Town in general. But for us, there was a very deep connection in terms of the stories that we can uncover by claiming those human remains as our own, as part of our community, as part of our ancestors, if you will, about how people, Black people, occupied the city, lived in the city, and were systematically erased from the city as well.
So Prestwich Street happens at a really crucial moment in terms of the city of Cape Town and the struggle around the nature of the future of the city. 2004, early 2000s, beginning of the property boom, beginning of kind of rampant gentrification in parts of the city. I think District 6 is almost the ground zero for reimagining an inclusive future for the city. And in interesting ways, Prestwich Street, Greenpoint, the historical District 1, becomes another kind of ground zero precisely at that moment. The football stadium lies in the future. There's a big focus on gentrifying Greenpoint. So there's a lot at stake. And it's a moment where the city might have said, let's think about what it would mean to have affordable housing as part of these desirable inner city areas. Let's think about how we can imagine Cape Town as a city that doesn't simply recapitulate apartheid spatial planning. Another one of those lost opportunities.
Yeah. Development almost seems to be the thing that the city cares about the most, and everything else happens around it, whether it's heritage, whether it's memory, whether it's education.
The gentrification of this area starts way back, even with the emancipation of enslaved people. The economy, the burgeoning way of mercantile capital needed more people. Here, relatively free, but constrained by an ordinance that required you to be in apprenticeship, that restricted your mobility. So it was a pass law under another name. And so that spoke about how you were owned and how you were then in death disowned. And then consequent narrative, how that memory and that legacy is owned and disowned is then perpetual and continues into the so-called post-apartheid society that we are living in.
And so what has happened over years of sort of colonial apartheid segregation and displacement is that you have people who were just systematically removed from it and people who lost connection to the place. And so for us, I think the walking aspect of Emancipation Day, walking through District 6, walking to Prestwich for the weekly vigils that used to happen as well, I think it was a very important way of saying, you can't ignore us, we are here, we exist, and we can occupy these spaces as well.
That's when I started my project, but I came to Prestwich Street prior to that, sort of in 2016. I heard about the site and I thought that I could do research on the human remains. Initially, that was the plan. I wanted to do ancient DNA research. I thought that would be an important way of thinking about who these ancestors were. Archaeology in that moment and subsequently had been a very exclusionary discipline and prevented an alternative archaeology from developing.
In South Africa, we should note, archaeology at this point is an almost entirely white discipline. So it's white archaeologists working on human remains with whom they claim no lineal descent.
When we asked, what is it that archaeology, examination of human remains, can contribute to the world, and particularly a post-apartheid world, 10 years, as you say, into democracy. We're looking at the world in it with different lens. And all we could hear, all we were told was, we could tell you what kind of labor people did, because we could check on their calluses, where the calluses were they working on their knees, were they pulling ropes from the shore.
And so it takes us to that question of, are these artifacts or are they ancestors? So the move is to turn people into objects. The question of knowledge goes to the heart of what was at stake, I think. So what is the basis of a meaningful relationship to the past? Is it empirical information about diet and work habits? Or is it more than that? Is it different to that? Is it the whole question of what does it mean to be in a relationship of descendancy? And how do we deal with the unfinished business of the past? Right? So these are the forms of thoughtfulness that needed to be developed.
There are no tombstones, no names, no direct connections. And even with the best of science like DNA testing, you might zero in on some probabilities, but you really will never know. But because we don't know and because there aren't immediate names, we must not ever allow for the ancestors of those of us who've lived in the city and who now occupy the city. We must never allow indignity.
When I look at this space, I see it not as a space of memory, but as a space of a kind of institutionalized forgetting. That forgetting extends to the dead of Prestwich Street themselves, who are located behind us in a kind of underground vault. Each person is placed in a cardboard box about so big, and you have these stacks of cardboard boxes arranged on concrete shelves. And there's a kind of drive to kind of regulate and make everything equivalent and stacked up. This is real tidying up of the past.
And so we're sitting in this coffee shop that has a strange connection to the human remains that are, 200 meters away from where we are, where they were actually uncovered. And so the journey across this very busy Somerset Road to be in this space is both interesting and strange and disconnected and feels a bit forgotten at this point. Imagine them, they've traveled from wherever their homeland was. They really literally worked to the bone at the Cape. They're buried in this informal burial ground, or let's say unofficial burial ground for slaves. Then they are disinterred. They put into a warehouse, which was claimed that it was being treated with dignity, but we have actually evidence that there were some times when human remains were mixed up with paint tins and bottles of water and all the equipment that they needed for disinterring the human remains. Then, based on that complaint to the city, there is a ceremonial transfer of those human remains to Woodstock Hospital, the mortuary, and then that hospital is needed. And so then they are carted then back to Somerset Hospital to be stored there, and then eventually end up in this space.
And then everything like pushed underground and forgotten, consigned, like the consignment of the past, the forgetting of the past.
People who carry those remains have told amazing stories of what they experienced, what they felt, what hauntings they felt just touching these remains. This space actually emerged out of a compromise with a 5-partner coalition consisting of SARA, Heritage Western Cape, the Prestwich Place Project Committee, District 6 Museum, and the City of Cape Town. And there were lots of discussions about what would happen to the human remains after the tribunal that was held by the Department of Arts and Culture, which was about leaving the remains in the ground and declaring that a site of conscience. But by the time the tribunal happened, it was almost a moot point because they'd all been quietly disinterred already.
In terms of just thinking about heritage management and thinking about how heritage agencies think about ancestors, right? It's an anomaly. It's not the norm. Human remains belong in repositories that are curated, that have a particular temperature. But people don't know how to manage the space because they can only imagine managing heritage and human remains as heritage within very particular disciplinary confines.
The museum in particular has a very strong link to this idea of memorialization as ephemeral, as something that we create with each other in space, in a very particular place. I think there's an element of recognizing that a space was needed to remember the discovery of the burial ground and to remember the complexities of what it meant to fight to prevent the burial ground from being exhumed.
The last time there was sort of a discussion, it was sort of that they need to be buried. And they need to be buried here because of the way that the city works, you know, that they are sort of in a precarious place at the moment, even though this should be a final resting place. And so I think Prestwich is quite powerful in that way, and the committee is quite powerful in that way as well, that they created this. I think that they were just systematic, blockages,
We took a long time to give up on the dream of what the space should be. We imagined bringing school kids here and having these programs. We imagined bringing also former residents of this District 1 area where the human remains were found and also where this coffee shop is located, and we would have reunion sessions. We were planning to do oral histories, and this was going to be such a vibrant space. And so Truth, the brand of Truth Coffee Shop, is very large in the kind of artisanal coffee brands in Cape Town. And that's what people remember. They engage with it now as a coffee shop with a kind of a strange and interesting story happening at the back, which you can actually choose not to engage with at all.
I think our lesson from that moment was that we had to occupy the space in a different way, and that buildings are sometimes prohibitive in really capturing the essence of what a site means.
There is a lot of hurt and there's a lot of frustration around the fact that there is so much bureaucracy around return of your ancestors. There is a lot of questioning of legitimacy of claimants, who constitutes the descendant community. There's a lot of not just suspicion, but also policing of knowledge.
But if you've pummeled people and you've separated them from the past and you try and define them outside of their roots, they float and believe that those things don't matter, and then the remains of people in the city. Part of the challenge, I believe, is to encourage Southern not just to be dependent on its wonderful body of expertise, archaeologists, scientists, but also to have much greater public participation.
20 years post Prestwich Street, one of the encouraging signs is that there is growth and movement in the discipline of archaeology, also in South Africa, but also globally.
Yes.
And there are exciting emergent fields like indigenous archaeology and public archaeology, which are gaining in prominence and which introduce the kind of thoughtfulness into the discipline which was lacking by and large in the case of Prestwich Street. So I think, my hope is that Prestwich Street does continue to provide us with a learning moment, a moment of reflection, and a moment also for archaeology and archaeologists to reflect on both the sort of achievements and mistakes made.
When we talk about community and who is the community and how do we work with the community, I think it's that it's creating space to create that community and imagining what Cape Town's community looks like beyond what social and spatial engineering creates and beyond what archaeologists and other disciplines recreate and re-perpetuate.
The dominant narrative of slavery is about the transatlantic. It's a Black American or what happened to people in Brazil or even in Cuba. But our story was in the shadow of the dominant narrative of the national liberation narrative, of the emancipation of all oppressed people, but Black Africans in particular. We do ourselves as a nation a great injustice when we allow one narrative to dominate and to neglect the kind of foundation cornerstone of building the city. It was a slave society. It was populated people, and it was a group out of the contribution, not only as labor, but as skilled and in-skilling people into the architecture, into the way the streets were laid out, and the overall ambiance and conviviance. Cape Town, because of the diverse Creole mulatto community, becomes a gathering ground, a marvelous, enriching tapestry that ought to be celebrated.
Attempts throughout the years and throughout many years of people trying to sort of evoke this idea and feeling of emancipation. And I think what the link is between the discovery of the burial ground, the activism that happened around Prestwich and the museum is really about, I think, reintegrating that story, that practice, that performance back into the city, I think. And for us, as someone who was maybe younger in the institution at the time the burial ground was discovered, it was such an important moment in understanding that the way that we occupy spaces is also celebratory. It's not just about mourning, it's not just about contestation, it's also about we can remember the past, but Prestwich allows us to think about who were these people and who do we imagine them to be, and then how do we celebrate that feeling and who they were.
We need to think about the world differently, how we think about land being not just captured by this whole notion of real estate value, but also people's relationship to the land, the living and the dead. I do believe that there is a way to recoup some of what was meant to happen in a place where these human remains have been interred. And so 17 years later, we're beginning to feel that these remains must go back into the ground.
I would like to, with the symbolic closing of these gates, just signal a time of reflection and a time of also broader consultation, and signal a time for us to really draw in more people into this process, so that the many stories that have not been told will enter into the space as well.